Second. Okay. So what I'm going to cover today are some interesting statistics. It's hard actually in some ways to find some current ones, but what I'm going to do is go through what's the actual economic impact of mental health and mental illness on the economy in Canada. Of course, the numbers for COVID-19 still aren't known, but just some of the research that I've done, it's definitely going to have an impact. I think we all hear about people being laid off. Governments, if you look at Ontario, and I'm not playing politics, we have a conservative government in power, and they're talking about spending billions of dollars to make sure that people get paychecks. It's widely acknowledged that what's happening right now is kind of unprecedented, which requires a unique approach to things. Sorry, before I forget also, if you have any questions, I do have a Q&A session at the end. What I would ask is that you please save it until the end, just so that way we have time to get through all the content. And that way we get to do as many questions as we can. The letters, these are common diagnoses that everybody's probably heard of, ADHD, ADD, things like that. And I'm gonna go through them really, really quickly at the end of the slide deck. And again, I will do my best to make sure the slide deck is available to everybody. I do have some additional slides that go into those conditions in more detail. What I want everyone to get a sense of, hopefully, is just that these conditions typically have anxiety as something that accompanies them. The technical word is comorbid when you talk about having different conditions at once. I personally hate that. It's quite a morbid type of description. So I like to say associated or commonly occur at the same time. I'll define anxiety. There's different kinds of anxiety. There's anxiety that's thought-based. There's anxiety that's emotional-based. You can have both at the same time. And the treatment for them is very different. I'll talk about the stress, what causes stress at home for people, especially children. What are common things, stressors for children today in 2020, outside of the pandemic, of course. A lot of it probably won't be news to you if you're a parent. And it's good for all of us to focus just on what our kids are dealing with and how can we help them make sure that they're able to do their best in challenging situations. How to deal with anxiety. So assuming I get through everything, I'm going to go through some specific techniques that can help control anxiety attacks and panic attacks, as well as talking in general about how to maybe talk to your family right now about COVID-19 while we're all at home. How do we get through this period without killing each other in the process? I've also put in some useful resources. This is based on my opinion. You may find that they're not. You may find that there's other ones that you can do as well. But these are something that I've been able to find for everybody in order to help you out. And again, at the end, I'll go through Q&A. But first of all, let's take a deep breath and don't forget that even in really, really challenging situations, we can still laugh at things. The pandemic is real, it's very serious, but it's also not the worst illness that's ever happened to human beings. And I'm not being flippant whatsoever, but part of getting through something like this is actually keeping things in context for what they really are. So these are some things that I just found on the internet. I did not create them. I'm not that creative. Right? And when you look at the homeschooling, it's really easy to be given a link and being told, hey, here's stuff to do with your kids. It's another thing to actually do it, which can be very, very difficult. So for those of you struggling with activities for your kids at home to get them through the day, don't feel alone. It's a very common struggle, even for people who are teachers. It's not easy for them to get through this. I kind of find the whole toilet paper thing kind of amusing. I don't know why it's been such a
people think they need it.
Why it's been such a run on toilet paper. I saw one person buying 240 rolls at one point.
Bums aren't runny.
Okay, so some interesting statistics. When I put this together, it just could be that I wasn't looking in the right place, but looking at 2011, this is some pretty big numbers. $16.6 billion in hit to the economy based on 9.3 days of absence for the average full-time employee. And if you think of that, only 46% of companies are actually tracking employee absences. It makes you wonder what the real number actually is, because it would likely be a lot higher. Sorry, a couple of people messaging me. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and please make sure you mute your microphones and just leave them off. At the end, we'll do a QA. According to CAMH, and this is where it really stands out, I think, beyond just dollar values. 70% of mental health problems that people have start in childhood, and 3/4 of that, so 75%, do not get specialized services, right? If you think about any problem a person has in their life, the easiest way, the most effective way to deal with it is when the condition or the problem is new, most problems anyways. And for 75% of the challenges that people are experiencing not getting dealt with as children, it's leading to that big cost that we see to the economy and as adults. Mental illness represents 10% of Canadian disease, but there's a $1.5 billion shortfall in terms of funding. Now, hopefully that's going to change over time as more and more people are understanding the impact of mental health. That's a $51 billion cost to the economy just on disease in general. The second leading cause of death for young people, so it's ages 15 to 24, is suicide, right? That's a staggering number, that people that age are deciding to take their own lives, and that's the second leading cause of death at that age. When we look at COVID itself, I'm not going to pretend to know the numbers because I don't think anybody does. I found a couple of links which seemed fairly credible to me and reliable. BNN Bloomberg just talks about the potential of a recession. We've all seen the oil prices coming down. So on the one hand, it's great that we're able to fill our cars up at a really low price. But what does that mean for the Western Canada in terms of oil production and for those companies and the employees of those companies? With anxiety going up with COVID-19, speaking for myself, I know that mine has been quite high over a bunch of things. It's gonna impact the population. It's gonna impact the economy. It's gonna impact people when we do get back to work. And it's something that we need to think about and start planning for now and dealing with now. And again, it's easier to prevent an issue and to try to treat it while it's early than to ignore it and then deal with it in the future. So what are the letters? So ADD is attention deficit disorder, and very related to that is ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So these are conditions that it's the child or the adult for that matter, but it's the child who sits in class and can't focus. It's the child who you ask them to do something, and if you ask them to do more than 2 or 3 things at a time, they might get through the first thing, but then have a struggle remembering what the second or third was. So you could ask your kid to go up to the room and clean up and bring down something. By the time they get to the room, they've legitimately forgotten that you asked them to clean up, and of course what you wanted them to bring down. So you're, as the parent, waiting for them downstairs, and they just don't come back. As parents, that's really frustrating, but this is part of what goes with that type of condition. The hyperactivity in ADHD is a child or an adult who just has endless energy. They can't sit still. They're impulsive. They're in class, and they're the ones who are always raising their hand before the teacher even finishes asking the question. They're the kid who, when they're playing sports, is very impulsive, that somebody bumps into them, and rather than taking a step back and saying to themselves, it's part of the sport, I got bumped into, they don't have that control in terms of their response. They're hyperactive, and immediately they're going to push back. ODD, and again, each of these conditions could be an entire webinar on their own, so I know I'm not doing it justice, but just giving a very high-level overview. So ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, is a child who essentially doesn't do what they're told to do. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's very, very frustrating as an adult, as a parent, or as a coach or a teacher, when you're asking a child to do something simple. Let's say it's a teacher saying, please go back to your seat, And not only does a kid not do it, but they say, no, I'm not going to. It's a very challenging condition, again, to deal with. Typically, I won't use the word comorbid, but ODD does a lot of times present itself with other conditions as well. But there are ways to deal with it, which is important to know. ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So autism, in the past, a lot of people have heard of Asperger's. So there used to be 3 different definitions or diagnoses, that would go under which currently go under the ASD umbrella. It was Asperger's, it was autism, and PDD-NOS, which was pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And essentially, that was when a person had a developmental challenge, but it didn't fit any of the other categories, so it was called PDD-NOS. When the latest manual was created, the DSM-5, when it was revised from version 4, it was decided to have all the different versions of autism just called autism spectrum disorder. The one argument in favor of merging them was around government benefits, that depending on the condition you're diagnosed with, some countries and some plans and governments would recognize, say, Asperger's or autism as a disability, but not PDD-NOS, let's say. And for the family, it really didn't make a difference. The amount of money and the support they would need for their child may not be that different. So by putting them all under autism, I think it was believed that this would help standardize the treatment and the availability to resources that people would have. The downside is when you look at a person who is autistic versus having what was called Asperger's in the past, there are some differences. Typically, somebody with Asperger's is verbal. They may or may not go to a regular school. This person has communication issues, and the best example I could think of would be Sheldon Cooper. If you ever watched The Big Bang Theory, that would be very different than a person who is much further down along the autism spectrum. If you ever remember the movie Rain Man that had Dustin Hoffman in it, Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman's character, would be an example of somebody who's much further along the autism spectrum than Sheldon Cooper would be. So to call those two conditions the same really isn't right either, because they are quite different, and the treatment needs of both of those individuals are quite different. There's an expression about autism that when you've met one person with autism, it means you've met one person with autism. And it can be a very challenging disability to have because it's very individualized. There's some people with autism who will have ADD or ADHD as well, and there's others who do not. There's people that will have, that will be verbal, and you can have great conversations with them, and they can share emotions, but they might have just a lot of trouble controlling themselves and understanding emotions. And then there can be other people who can be verbal, and yet they don't get sarcasm. And they're very black and white in terms of the emotions that they present to other people. So again, very, very different, but all under the same diagnosis currently. The reason that I have anxiety and depression in red is that not only are they standalone diagnoses on their own, but also they typically will accompany other diagnoses. So often a kid with ADHD will be diagnosed with anxiety as well. And I'll talk about that going forward. Anxiety is typically a person's thoughts and fears about the future. And where that gets us into trouble is that there's a lot of things that we think that are true, but really aren't. And where anxiety becomes a problem for us is where we have a thought that won't stop. So you might be thinking, I have a test tomorrow and I'm going to fail it. And the more you think about that, the more it bothers you. There may not be any proof that you're actually going to fail that test. But because you think you are, the anxiety begins, and it gets worse and worse and worse, which might actually lead to the person being so nervous when they write the exam, or the test or the exam, that they actually do wind up failing it. And I will talk a bit more about anxiety in detail. Depression. These are a person's negative thoughts and feelings about something that's happened in the past. What I've found when working with people is that anxiety is somewhat easier to help a person with, because it's easier to explain to a person that what they're thinking may not be true, whereas depression typically is based on something that did happen. For both anxiety and depression, there are people who just their baseline, due to brain chemistry, tends to make them susceptible to that. In these conditions here, in these cases here, I'm talking about when it's because of something, not just the way a person's born. And it's really important to note that a person who has ADHD, let's say, the way they're diagnosed is based on certain behaviors and the frequency that they appear, and how many locations that they take place in. So all of us typically have those behaviors ourselves. To get diagnosed, it means you've hit a certain threshold that would then lead to the diagnosis, versus if you're on the other side of the threshold, you're just somebody with a lot of energy, let's say, with ADHD. What I find really interesting is that when we look through history at the people that have been thought leaders and inventors and people that have really led society, it's been argued that a lot of these people were either on the autism spectrum or had conditions like ADHD. And the reason is the way their brains are wired is very, very different than most people's. And it's not just in a negative way. These people are not broken. Their brain wiring is different. And what that allows somebody with ADHD to do, let's say, is to have 1,000 thoughts at one time. So they can be inventors. You give them a situation and they can think of 20 ways to fix it. Where their challenge is once they've come up with the idea, is actually implementing it. And that's when, if they're partnered with somebody who's more grounded, then the success these two people and this team would have is astounding. The reason why people with ADHD or ADD have a lot of challenges in society, especially as children, is that mindset, the impulsivity, doesn't fit into the traditional school environment. So it's not that there's anything wrong with them. It just means that the way they're created, the way they're born, and the school system and what's expected at home, let's say, there's a conflict between those two things. So this is another meme that I found on the internet. Again, toilet paper. Again, I mentioned earlier, I did see somebody buying 240 rolls of toilet paper at one time. I'm not sure, this is a week ago, so hopefully they still have some left. But it's gonna be interesting going forward, as somebody who's 5 or 6 today, when you ask them in, 4 years, 5 years, what did they remember about the pandemic in 2020? I just think it's gonna be really interesting if toilet paper is gonna be part of their recollection. So what are anxiety and depression? And the reason why I'm linking them is because a lot of times they do come together. And, as I mentioned, depression is a person's thoughts about the past. Anxiety are their thoughts and feelings about the future. And often they come together. So it's really important to talk about them not as standalone conditions, but as conditions that can be related. So, the letters. Imagine, let's say you have ADHD, or you're autistic, whatever your diagnosis happens to be, doesn't matter. Throughout the day, you're probably being told all the things that you do wrong. You're being compared to other people, likely in a negative way. You probably have a ton of strengths that other people wouldn't have, but they're invisible. They may not be something that you can demonstrate in the normal school environment or at home. So imagine that's what you're living through, starting when you're born. You get old enough to start to understand speech. So 1 year, 2 years, you're a toddler, then you're a younger person, a 5-year-old, then you become a teenager. I'm skipping obviously 3 years. And over all that time, the amount of negative attention that you're given far outweighs the positive. Anxiety is very common, and that, in my opinion, is a big part of it. But again, it's really, really important to recognize that these people do have strengths. And I'll talk about it in a follow-on slide. As frustrating as it can be, it's also not necessarily their fault. A lot of the behaviors that they do are not because they're choosing to do it, it's because they can't help it necessarily. So it doesn't mean that the behaviors are good and you want to encourage them, but it is important to recognize when a behavior may not be a conscious decision, and that has a huge impact on how you hopefully will deal with it. A lot of anxiety and depression is biological in nature. It could run in families. It's a person's brain chemistry that they're just more prone to anxiety. Their baseline is higher than somebody else's. If you've ever heard of the zones of regulation, it's basically a color-coded system that's taught to children that will help them understand the different different moods that they can have. So green would be a calm mood, like a traffic light. Yellow is when they're starting to get escalated, and red is when they're having an explosion. I'm leaving blue out, which is when a person's depressed right now. A person whose brain chemistry is more susceptible to anxiety, it could be that their baseline tends to be more in the yellow than somebody else's. So for them, yellow is just what they're used to. And that's important to recognize that, imagine being a person going through life and everything can cause you stress. And then you're being told all the time, what's wrong with you? Why are you always upset? That makes you more stressed, right? And that'll increase depression as you start thinking about all these experiences and a lot of them negative that have happened in your past. A lot of conditions, I know, environmental, I'm just using COVID-19 as one example. There's a lot of stuff that happens, kids, adults, we read the news, we hear about what's going on in the world. So typically we don't hear about the happy stories. It's always about the negative, and that can increase a person's anxiety and depression. Social media. There's a ton of issues that I see right now with social media, that the way it's being used. I've heard that Facebook and Instagram are looking, Instagram may have already done it, at changing the way likes are done and maybe getting rid of likes, because there's a lot of teenagers and younger people that they do a post on their social media and they get 2 likes, let's say, from their social circle, and yet a friend of theirs gets 100. So this person who's only gotten 2 now thinks there's something wrong with them. So social media is not, it does a lot of great things, but it has a lot of negative side effects to it that we need to be aware of. What drives me crazy is how much texting and instant messaging people do instead of actually talking to people. And why that bothers me is 70 to 80% of all communication is nonverbal. One of the things I do when I'm working with people is I'll turn my back to them. So if you were my client right now, just to show how much communication goes on between people that's nonverbal, I'll actually turn my back, right? And while doing that, I'll say something, and because they can't see the expression on my face, it might be very hard for them to understand what I've actually said, or actually the words they understand, but the meaning may be lost. When I'm facing them and say the exact same thing, then it's really easy to see if I was joking or if I was serious or something else. And I encourage everybody, texting, messaging does have its place, but remember, and especially with kids, how many fights and challenges kids are going to have because they read something, maybe misunderstand the context in which something was sent to them, and that leads to an argument. It leads to fighting between the kids, which maybe would have been avoided if they're actually talking to each other and seeing each other. Challenging home environments. Some people, at home, they can afford lots of really cool things for their kids, and other people just can't. Kids go to school, and some kids are dressed in all the latest fashions. They've got an iPhone 11, and there's other kids whose parents say to them, I'm not giving you a phone. There's kids at home where the parents don't get along. There's kids at home where, nutrition isn't what it needs to be. And again, not necessarily through any fault of the parents, but these are just things that this child's experiencing, which can lead to anxiety and depression. The last bullet that I have here, I don't have anything after it, and the reason is that there are so many different things that can contribute to anxiety and depression. It's impossible to list them all right here. But it's really important to know that everybody experiences anxiety and depression to some extent. Everybody on the call right now experiences anxiety and depression to some extent. And it's important to understand, especially when we're thinking of our children, what is leading up to their feelings about anxiety and depression? What is causing them to feel the way they're feeling? So anxiety and depression, I mentioned earlier, can occur at the same time. So depression, just as it's written here, is based on the past. It's a memory of something that has happened or is perceived to have happened. And that's the key, is that a person could have had a bad experience, but the way they remember it may be a lot worse, and the way they recall it is actually worse than it really happened. One of the things that I do when working with people that have depression is try to get them to take as much of the emotion out of a situation as they can, not to bury emotions, but in order to actually see what the facts are. The same thing with anxiety. When a person's stressed about the future, one of the approaches that I use, and it's called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's trying to get a person to look at what they're thinking and actually see, is what I'm thinking real? We create these environments in our heads that we believe are real, we convince ourselves are real, but really they're not. And when we challenge our thoughts, often we can find out that what we think isn't true. And that's one of the ways to help deal with anxiety and depression, is combating what we think is real with what reality actually is. So what is anxiety? I'm going to try to go a little bit faster now. It's basically a reaction to something that in our lives, a trigger. So it could be, I'm sitting in my office right now, I'm doing this webinar, and all of a sudden the power goes off. That would probably make my anxiety go pretty high, pretty fast. Hopefully the power would be able to come back on quickly. I could figure out what happened. I then reconnect to the internet, or I send a message out to everybody through Facebook afterwards, apologizing. And hopefully I was able to then resolve what happened within myself, the condition, the situation. I've been able to figure out what happened, why it happened. I dealt with it, it's over. So now I don't necessarily have anxiety that's lasting with me in the future. A disorder, an anxiety disorder, is when the anxiety, the trigger, doesn't get resolved. And a lot of times anxiety can exist. And another way to look at it is, the top stream here shows, a trigger. Something happens that's going to cause a person to be stressed. It's a perceived threat or it's a real threat. But to that person, it's perceived. They believe it's real. There's an anxiety response. So it could be to fight it, to run away from it, to freeze in place, to deal with it, but it's resolved. So that way the person can then go on with their life, and whatever that trigger was is dealt with. Other times what happens is there's a trigger, so there's still a perceived threat, but the response to it could be exaggerated. It might not be appropriate. It could be that a person runs away from a situation that really they could have resolved. So what happens is the situation emotionally and in their thoughts hasn't been resolved. It's still there. So the anxiety might go down, but the next time that situation presents itself, it reactivates. And a lot of times when it reactivates, it does it much stronger than the original time. And that's the difference between an anxiety disorder or an anxiety that's unhealthy versus just normal anxiety that we experience on a day-to-day basis. If we didn't have anxiety, it would be very bad for us, because anxiety is what helps us recognize danger. It helps us figure out how to deal with problems in our lives. And it's a very important part of being human. Just it doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. There's others as well, but there's separation anxiety disorder. So this is, you see it a lot of times with really young people, even older, where it's a kid who doesn't want to be left alone. It could be a kindergarten or a daycare where they hang on to the parent's leg and don't let go. Now that happens to lots of kids. If it's still happening at the end of the year, there might be something else going on with that kid compared to other ones. And there's a lot of things that we could go into in terms of why does a person have that. Selective mutism. So these are people that have a very hard time talking in different situations. So they'll present as mute in some places, but maybe not in others. A phobia. So, arachnophobia. I hate spiders. When I see a spider, I get this emotional response. Some people are like that with dogs. Some people are like that with heights or with elevators. And that's more of an emotional type of anxiety that as soon as the stressor presents itself, rather than thinking about what's there, what's called the amygdala, the part of your brain that gets involved with this, activates really quickly, and you have a panic attack, you have anxiety. Agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder. GAD, to me, in a lot of ways, is the hardest one to treat for people, because it doesn't always have a specific cause. These are people whose anxiety just tends to be more active than other people's as they go through their life. And again, could be the person with the elevated brain chemistry compared to other people. And again, is it emotional or is it thought-based? And there's a book that I'm going to recommend at the end of the presentation, which goes through this. So emotional is rapid onset. So again, it's somebody who's afraid of dogs, and they see a dog, and they're rooted in place. Phobias. A lot of times there are associations with smells, with objects, with different places, and the treatment typically for that would be exposure therapy. So it would be a gradual process. So if a person's afraid of a dog, you wouldn't necessarily just have them sit in a small room and throw dogs at them. And I don't mean to be flippant, but in the end, for that person to get over their fear, they will have to come in contact with dogs in a very controlled environment. People with, for example, a phobia around elevators are introduced to elevators. They can be walked over to one. They can be given access to one, show them what the buttons do, and intellectually they know this. But it could be they had a bad experience, and by having them go through the motions again of getting used to what the elevator is, understanding that the fear they have may not be grounded in fact, it is how they get over it. And it's also thought-based, so rumination. These are thoughts that most people have at different parts in their lives where we just can't stop thinking about something. And the more that we think about it, the more upset we get. And the treatment for that type of anxiety, so thought-based, typically is cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and a lot of different approaches as well. So how do we reduce anxiety? Here's another, this is from Twitter that I found. Again, for the parents out there, it's been a long week, 2 weeks now, I guess, or 1.5 weeks. So it's good to find some things to laugh at. So first of all, remember that kids it can be are adults as well, right? When a person, for example, is autistic, if they enter the workforce and now they're at work, they still have the diagnosis. They still have the way their brain is wired is the way their brain is wired. These people are not bad, right? And an analogy, an example I really think is powerful is if you're walking down the street with a person who's using crutches, would you get mad at them for being slower than you, right? If they hit you with the crutches, yeah, that's an unacceptable behavior, which has to be potentially disciplined and discouraged, but you're not going to get mad at them because they're walking slowly. So if a person has ADHD, it doesn't mean that the behaviors that they're doing have to be excused, but when they're understood, it does make it a lot easier to deal with, both for them and for caregivers. Be predictable. When I think most people don't enjoy change. When you have a schedule and all of a sudden it gets changed, thrown out. Think of schools. It was supposed to be a 3-week break, the original March break +2. Now it's unknown. Nobody likes to have that type of uncertainty. Let your kids, as much as you can, understand what's going to happen during the day. Don't react to everything they do. And this is really, really hard. I forget who came up with this expression. It wasn't me. But you don't have to catch every ball they throw. So it is okay to ignore things that they say. Listen to them and give them positive attention. It's not going to fix a lot of their behaviors right away. But when you can balance the negative with as much positive as you can, as this individual goes through their life, the anxiety and depression that they may experience might be less when they can think of, say, their parents, their mother, their father, aunts, uncles, grandparents, siblings, have also been encouraging them and giving them positive feedback, telling them about the things they do that are really good. And that's really, really important. They're so used to being told what they do wrong. These people are often crying out for a friend. If you have a child with one of these diagnoses, give them a hug. Even when you've had a fight, it may not be something that you want to do right then, and that's fine. But make sure you reconnect with them. You debrief with them. Talk about your feelings, in a way that they will understand, and ask them to talk about theirs. It's really important to have this dialogue to make sure that these people who are depending on their caregivers know that their caregivers are there for them and actually do care. Dealing with the pandemic right now, use age-appropriate language. So if you're talking with a 4 or 5-year-old who might realize something's different, you probably wouldn't want to go into a lot of statistics and talking about the chance of people getting sick versus dying and stuff like that, unless you've had a death in the family, which is because of it. With a really young child, my approach would just be to talk about, what's happening right now is a lot of people are getting really, really bad colds, and we're staying home to make sure that we don't get it. Again, age appropriate. Validate their feelings. If your child, if your spouse, if your parents are feeling anxiety, if they're feeling uncertain, let them know that that's okay, that you probably share in those feelings, right? Let them know that what they're feeling is real, and they're not alone in it. Learn the facts yourself. And again, make sure that if you're worried about something, it's something real and not just something that you think is real. There's a link that I've put here from CAMH, which goes through how to talk to kids. If your kid is telling you they're bored, tell them, yeah, staying home, not having friends over, it's boring, right? Let them know that it's a natural thing that they're going through right now. I would encourage you as much as you can, based on the kid, of course, and their interactions with their friends. Make sure that they still talk to their friends and family, and if possible, not just through video games. It's really important for everybody in society right now that we still talk to each other, that we see each other. So, FaceTime, Skype, however you want to do it, even for a couple of minutes, right? If your kids have grandparents, have them call them once a day, more than once a day too, but have them call just to say hi. Doesn't have to have a purpose behind it. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. If your kid was going to bed at 8 o'clock, if they go to bed at 8:30 now because there's no school, sure, but make sure they're sleeping. Sleep is one of the foundations of mental health, and it's going to help them cope with any stress that they have over the next week, 2 weeks, or whatever it turns out to be. As much structure as you're able to put into their day, put it in. And again, best effort. Everybody's different in terms of what they're able to do based on work schedules, but make sure that you get your kids outside as much as you can. It's March going into April, but the weather's getting nicer, hopefully. So, just go for walks around the block. Just fresh air is a great way to help with mental health. Screen time, I kind of think you have to use your own judgment right now on what you think is appropriate for your kid. But don't be afraid to say no. Don't think that your kid now doesn't need to have boundaries and be encouraged to do what they're supposed to do. And finally, don't dismiss your own stress, right? Nobody likes to be stressed. Nobody likes to have uncertainty, but by embracing it and actually just admitting it to yourself, it makes it easier to deal with because it's not going to go anywhere. I'm going to go really quickly now. In terms of mindfulness techniques, these are ways to get yourself to focus on the present rather than the past or the future based on depression and anxiety. These are 3 really quick exercises that you can do. When you use your senses, for most people, that's going to overpower your thoughts. So if you look around and identify, if possible, out loud, everything that you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, that might help shut down your thoughts, even just for a short period of time. Sensing something actively and thinking is hard to do. If you say to yourself out loud, stop thought. Different parts of your brain are getting involved. There's your speech center, your auditory center, you're thinking it, so it's part of your cortex. And it's hopefully taking power away from any thoughts that you're having, the rumination that's causing you to be stressed. If you write it down and read it to yourself, you even get more parts of your brain. And abdominal breathing, think of that as deep breathing. It's basically put your hand on your stomach, and as you're breathing, feel it go in and out. Lie down on your back. This would be something great to do with kids, especially younger ones, and put a stuffed animal on your stomach. Have everybody do it. And the goal is to breathe and have it go up and down, but not fall off. And if you're able to slow your breathing down, chances are you're going to be able to slow your thoughts down, and your heart will follow suit as well. So some resources that you can use. Again, one more of the memes that I found. This is a book that I really, really enjoy. I typically don't recommend books to people, but this one is my exception because I find that it's really easy to understand You don't have to have any psychology background to go through it. And it does have good examples as to how to deal with stress and anxiety. It's also not very expensive. And I find that what it recommends is practical versus just a hypothetical type of way to deal with things. Some websites that I found, Sesame Street has one on COVID right now. So for younger children, look at it yourselves first, but I think it'd be a great way to start. Organizations like CAMH, UNICEF, the CDC of the United States, these are all reputable organizations that are putting out information on how to deal with COVID, how to talk to your kids. The UNICEF one talks about TikTok. I'm not a big fan of TikTok, unless it's used properly, I guess. But again, check these out. Hopefully there's something here that you'll find useful. And this is a real thank you. If anybody on the call is a nurse or a doctor, or just a frontline worker in any capacity, thank you very, very much. And I really mean that sincerely. These people are going to work knowing that they can get infected, that they have a better chance. It's stressful. They're the ones that are seeing the sick people. So as hard as it is for us to sit at home, I think what they're going through is much more difficult, and we owe them a great round of applause. So at this point, I'm going to turn off the slideshow so I can see comments. Thank you very much. We've been going for about 50 minutes right now. Are there any questions at this point? I see one. Okay. So Yaz has a question. So 1 second. Yaz, if you can unmute yourself, please ask your question.
So I guess I'm just curious if this is more of a cognitive-based approach, so like a more CBT-based approach to working with children in anxiety instead of like an attachment-based approach.
Yeah, because we're like, well, first of all, it depends on the cause, right? It depends on what the condition that you're dealing with is. If it's COVID, like something specific like that, to me, it's not necessarily an attachment issue. I mean, there could be attachment issues where the child isn't getting the support at home they need from their parents. But to me, that it's kind of making sure people understand as much as we're able what reality is, and making sure that we try not to guess what reality is, if that makes sense. So I do like CBT, but I also don't like it religiously in terms of from a therapeutic point of view. But for COVID, yes, I definitely would want to be fact-based. Attachment is a big thing I use in practice in general, because that does have a big impact on how people develop. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Great. David.
Hi, I have a question. It's regarding a child who is too young for CBT,
Okay.
but who also ruminates and has OCD tendencies, though slight right now, but he is very young. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know like more about how to deal with nightmares and anxieties regarding, like in regards to, what if I had this dream? What if I watch something? What if it comes true to me? Like, what happens what do I do if it happens to me, type of deal. And also the second part of this is, what happens when this child has had like a traumatic event or that's been seared into his brain, and he ruminates over that. How would you get him over that?
So when you're saying young, what age are we talking about?
6-year-old boy. Okay,
so yeah, so for a 6-year-old, from the mental health side, you would probably want to talk to somebody who's good at what's called play therapy, because CBT with some kids that young, I think it could work, but typically it's not an approach I would use. Play therapy allows the therapist and the client to work together by using different playful situations to figure out what's going on and help a person communicate and learn, right? So let's say the kid's 4 or 5 and they're being bullied. To have a verbal discussion with them would be really hard. You mentioned OCD, I think. They may not really understand what compulsions are, what obsessions are. But if you do it through a play environment, some therapists like to use puppets. So you're externalizing it. You get the puppets to talk to each other. Those are ways with younger children to get, get the message across, to get them to understand and get them to communicate in a way that's appropriate for them. I typically work with people that are over the age of 10, and it's because CBT, to me, starts to become useful at around age 10. And so, I hope that answered the first part. What was the second part of your question?
The second part was if they've had like this traumatic event that seems to have seared into his brain, and he has nightmares about it, and he's just really worried about it happening to him.
So without knowing any detail, it's really hard to say. When people have experienced trauma, a lot of times, it's, if you remember I mentioned with anxiety, it's thought-based as well as emotion.
Yeah.
People, for example, with PTSD will have a lot of flashbacks. If there's a smell that's associated with what caused them the trauma, when they smell that, it's an instant reaction for them. They have trouble sleeping because when they close their eyes, a lot of times they relive what happened. So without knowing the details, it's really hard for me to say how I would approach it.
Well, it's not private, so if I could just share really quickly what happened, my mother.
You know what? I'd be happy to talk offline about that. I don't want to get into any specific cases, just
Okay.
for confidentiality.
That's fine.
But it really depends on what happened and how far in the past. So if it's an adult and something happened when they were a child, that would be a different approach than an adult and a year ago something happened to them. If you want, message me on Facebook and we can reconnect afterwards.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I see one from Pauline. Just give me 1 second to read it. So Pauline, this would be something, again, easier to talk about than just, I need a bit more detail, I think, than just what you wrote here. And again, with grade 1, it really depends on what the details are. Message me and we can find some time to talk after this. Svetlana, if you can unmute yourself, please, and go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that.
Okay.
I have a question. I have 2 questions actually. So one is my son will be 4.5, and we're expecting another sibling.
Okay.
And
Congratulations.
thank you. So it will be, I guess, in May when it's gonna happen. And I just want to sort of prepare myself because I know many kids go through a little bit of that, anxiety and also fears of mom, not always being there for them or something like that. And I just wanted to see what you could recommend, maybe before the labor, or even how to deal if the anxiety does occur.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a normal thing. A big part of it, I haven't specifically dealt with this, but just thinking, if my wife and I were expecting another child right now, and I had a 4-year-old, it would be maybe just making sure that the 4-year-old understands what the new baby means once the baby arrives, but also what it doesn't mean, right? So it doesn't mean that you're being replaced, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to get attention, but it means that, the amount of attention that the baby's going to need is a lot. So preparing them for it, maybe finding ways for them to help out, right, and take like an active role in helping, care for the child. Making sure you do stuff with the one that's already here, the 4.5-year-old, and finding time for them once the baby does arrive. It's making sure they know that yes, things are different, and they have to understand that also, right? That things are going to change, but just because there's a new boy or girl in the house, it doesn't mean that you're being replaced, and you're the oldest one, right? So you get to do things that they don't get to do, right? You get to watch TV until 7 o'clock,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's finding ways like that. If some sibling rivalry, I think, would be very normal. If once the baby arrives and then your child's not adjusting properly, and you have to give them time, and remembering, if they're 4.5, that's also really young in terms of being able to control stuff. It's giving them a time to feel comfortable with the new sibling.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the second question is because I've been spending obviously lots of time with him now because I am home, and prior to that we were in a smaller daycare.
Okay.
And everything seemed to be fine, but then once we switched to a bigger daycare in January, there were more children, newer staff, and one of the daycare providers that was in the other daycare is in a bigger daycare now. Now, because he started daycare at 16 months, he was the smallest one at the daycare, right? And now he's one of the bigger guys. So I feel like once he went to bigger daycare, all the anxiety started happening, less attention, and he started even, like teething on things. I don't know. I think I have a feeling it's a behavior thing because he doesn't do it at home because I give him attention, right?
Yeah. So Svetlana, you know what? This would be also one that let's connect in the future on that. It's hard to answer that really quickly now.
But how would you deal with, like, let's say now he's at home, but before he was in daycare, and then let's say the daycare's open again, like do you think this is gonna go back to, like, I guess
you know what, what's happening right now is unprecedented in terms of like people being home and everything, so I really don't know. It depends a lot on what the daycare is going to do when people come back.
Yeah.
Right. So like that, I'm happy to talk offline, like, message me, we can find some time, but it's really hard to say without more information.
Yeah.
And just really quickly, I've sent, hopefully everybody's been able to get it, the presentation file through Zoom. If you didn't get it, message me separately, and I can email it directly. There was a question from Aditi. Sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. So number one, it would depend on the age of the kid in terms of, so the question is, what about kids who are continuously going into hypoarousal, so disengaging to cope or inability to deal with noises, crowds, schools, things like that, and not paying attention to things around and daydreaming? Again, it's hard to say without knowing more, but how old is the kid? What is it in all settings? Is it in only certain settings? It could be that they could have a sensory disorder where if it's based on noise, when they go into a noisy environment, their hearing is sensitive, so they find that it's just not bearable. Again, it's hard to say. I would maybe, the starting point, again, depending how old they are and all that stuff, is just ask them in the appropriate way, of course. I've noticed that when this happens, you seem to be really upset. I'm so sorry to hear that. What's going on? What bothers you about noises? You know, are they being bullied? Is there a problem at home? Is it, again, it could be a medical issue that their hearing is sensitive. It's really hard to know. There's developmental disorders where sensory issues can be common as well. So it could involve trying to get a diagnosis, but I would need a lot more information to give a better approach. Are there any other questions? Sorry, I see one here from TBRECE Unites. I work at a daycare with high need families and children. That more and more signs of PTSD are occurring in the children through their anxiety behavior and progressive development. So if you're seeing that, there's a difference between PTSD versus just PTS, so post-traumatic stress, and just having stress, right? And there can be overlap in symptoms. So I'm not challenging you on this, by the way, since I know nothing about it, but I wouldn't jump to PTSD necessarily unless you're dealing with, for example, if the population was refugees coming from Syria, then very likely, you know, PTSD might make sense. In that type of situation, potentially a diagnosis would be important to actually know what you're dealing with. That would be done through either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But if it's occurring in a lot of the children, I would look for commonalities as a starting point. But I hope that answers your question. Okay. Well, did I miss anybody in terms of questions? I think I got everybody. Give me a few days. I will be posting this on my YouTube channel. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining in, for listening to me. This is the first webinar of this type that I've done. Any feedback, please be kind but honest. Would be welcome, because I would like to do this probably on a monthly basis going forward. So I would welcome feedback. Thank you very much for your time this evening, and stay safe, stay healthy. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.